300 meters. That's all that separated the American F-16 from the belly of the Russian strategic bomber. Close enough to see the missile bay doors, close enough to count the rivets, close enough that one wrong twitch of the control stick would turn two aircraft into a fireball that could ignite World War III. Inside his cockpit, the pilot's finger hovered over the weapon release, his heart hammering against his ribcage like a prisoner trying to escape. The bomber's turboprops churned the air into visible vortices, and somewhere in that Russian cockpit, another pilot was making the same impossible calculation. Hold course or break off. Trust or prepare for the worst. 4 hostile contacts had appeared on NORAD's radar screens just 27 minutes ago. Now they were here, in American airspace identification zone, and the invisible line between peace and catastrophe had become so thin you could slice your hand on it. This wasn't a training exercise. This wasn't a movie. This was the 9th time this year that Russian strategic bombers had pushed into Alaska's skies, but this time felt different. This time, the whole world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if someone would blink first or if someone would pull the trigger. Captain Sarah Mitchell felt her pulse quicken as she watched the symbols creep across the display. 2 massive Tu-95MS strategic bombers, their turboprop engines churning through the Arctic air, flanked by a pair of Su-35 fighter escorts that could turn the sky into a knife fight in seconds. This wasn't the first time Russian aircraft had probed America's northern defenses this year, but something about this approach felt different. The spacing between the aircraft, the altitude they maintained, the deliberate pace. It all suggested Moscow was sending more than just a routine patrol. They were delivering a message written in jet fuel and armed ordnance. Within moments of detection, the American response machine roared to life. An E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control system lifted off first, its massive rotating radar dome already sweeping the horizon for threats. This flying command post would become the nerve center of the entire operation, its crew orchestrating a ballet of interceptors and tankers across hundreds of miles of open sky. The orders crackled through encrypted channels, and 4 F-16C Fighting Falcons screamed down the runway at Elmendorf Air Force Base, their afterburners painting orange streaks against the gray Alaskan afternoon. Behind them, 4 KC-135 Stratotankers climbed into position, ready to pump thousands of pounds of fuel into the fighters and keep them airborne for as long as the crisis demanded. Lieutenant Marcus Chen gripped his flight stick as his F-16 punched through a layer of dense cloud, emerging into brilliant sunlight at 28,000 feet. His wingman tucked in tight on his right, while the second element of 2 fighters positioned themselves 3 miles ahead. The formation moved like a hunting pack, responsive and lethal. Through his headset, Chen heard the calm voice of the E-3 controller updating their vectors, guiding them toward an intercept point calculated to put American steel directly in the path of Russian ambition. Every pilot in that formation knew the rules of engagement by heart, but they also knew that rules could shatter in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The distance collapsed rapidly. At 50 miles, Chen's radar painted the Russian formation clearly. 2 large, slow-moving targets surrounded by the tighter signatures of fighter escorts. At 20 miles, he could make out contrails streaking across the sky ahead. At 5 miles, the shapes resolved into aircraft, and the reality of what they were facing settled over the American pilots like a cold weight. The Tu-95MS bombers looked like something from another era. Massive propeller-driven behemoths that seemed to belong in black and white photographs rather than a modern sky. But Chen knew better than to underestimate them. Each bomber could carry cruise missiles capable of striking targets 1,000 miles away, turning cities into ash without ever crossing into American airspace. The intercept happened at a distance that made Chen's mouth dry. Somewhere between 300 and 500 meters, close enough that he could see rivets on the Russian aircraft's fuselage, close enough that a sudden maneuver by either side could end in collision or combat. The Tu-95MS bombers maintained their heading with almost insulting confidence, their massive contra-rotating propellers chopping through the air at a steady 450 knots. The Su-35 escorts weaved protectively around their charges, occasionally rolling wings to flash their air-to-air missile loadouts at the Americans. It was pure theater, but deadly theater, a performance where the wrong gesture could trigger catastrophe. Chen positioned his F-16 off the Russian bomber's left wing, close enough to dominate, far enough to avoid provocation. His weapon systems were live. AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles for long-range engagements, AIM-9X Sidewinders for close-in dogfighting. Every weapon had been checked, rechecked, and armed before takeoff. The missile guidance computers hummed quietly, tracking solutions updating dozens of times per second. Chen's finger rested near the weapon release, following procedure, maintaining readiness. Around him, his squadron mates mirrored every move the Russian formation made, creating an invisible cage of American firepower that followed the intruders across the sky. The tension in those minutes was suffocating. Chen could hear his own breathing inside his oxygen mask, could feel sweat trickling down his spine despite the climate control. Through his canopy, he watched a Russian pilot in the nearest Su-35 turn his helmet toward the American jet, and for a brief instant, the two men made eye contact across the void. What passed between them was older than radar and missiles, a recognition that both were professionals, trapped in a game designed by politicians and generals, a game where the stakes were measured in megatons and the consequences could echo for generations. Back in the E3 century, controllers monitored every second of the encounter, feeding updates to NORAD headquarters where senior officers tracked the incident on wall-sized displays. The Russian aircraft maintained course, neither accelerating nor deviating, testing American resolve with every mile they flew deeper into the identification zone. Intelligence analysts scrambled to interpret the meaning behind the flight. Was this reconnaissance? Intimidation? A rehearsal for something larger? The bombers carried no visible external stores, but everyone knew they could be loaded in hours if Moscow gave the order. Then, after what felt like an eternity compressed into 15 minutes, the Russian formation began a slow turn. The massive bombers banked gently to the north, their escorts following in formation. Chen watched them go, maintaining his intercept position until the last possible moment before breaking off. The American fighters escorted the Russians back toward international airspace, ensuring they departed the zone cleanly, without incident. No missiles were fired, no borders were violated, no wars were started. But as Chen pulled his F-16 into a climbing turn toward the refueling track, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed a prelude rather than a conclusion. The debriefing at Elmendorf lasted hours. Pilots recounted every detail, headings, altitudes, formations, even the expressions they thought they saw on Russian faces through canopies. Intelligence officers collected gun camera footage and radar recordings, building a minute-by-minute reconstruction of the encounter. What emerged from the analysis was disturbing in its implications. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the third intercept in the same month, the 9th since the year began. Russian strategic aviation was returning to old Cold War patterns, probing the edges of American airspace with increasing frequency and boldness.
Chen sat in the debriefing room, his flight suit still damp with sweat, replaying those critical seconds when the Russian Su-35 had rolled inverted directly above his canopy. The maneuver had been pure showmanship, a calculated display of aggression that pushed boundaries without technically crossing them. But what haunted him more was the bomber crew's discipline. They never deviated, never flinched, flying their massive aircraft as if American fighters armed with live missiles were merely annoying insects. That level of confidence suggested either exceptional training or dangerous contempt for the consequences. Intelligence analysts noted something else troubling in the recordings. The Russian formations were flying tighter patterns than in previous encounters, suggesting improved coordination and possibly updated tactics. Each probe wasn't just theater, it was a learning exercise where Moscow collected data on response times, radar coverage gaps, and communication protocols. The Russians were studying American defenses the way a burglar cases a house before the robbery. NORAD's official statements described the encounters as routine, emphasizing that the Russian aircraft never violated sovereign airspace and posed no immediate threat. The language was carefully calibrated to avoid escalation, to project calm competence. But behind closed doors, the tone was different. Senior commanders recognized what the public didn't, that every intercept drained resources, wore down crews, and increased the statistical probability that someday, somewhere, something would go catastrophically wrong. Fighter pilots couldn't be kept at peak readiness indefinitely. Maintenance schedules couldn't be compressed forever. And human beings, no matter how well trained, made mistakes when pushed to exhaustion. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. While Alaska captured headlines with dramatic intercepts, Europe was experiencing its own wave of Russian provocations. A drone fell from the sky over Poland, its wreckage sparking fears that the war in Ukraine was metastasizing into NATO territory. Estonia reported a Su-35 briefly crossing its airspace, a violation that sent Baltic capitals into emergency sessions. Romanian officials complained that Russian aircraft were testing their borders during operations over the Black Sea. Each incident stood alone as a minor breach, but together they painted a picture of coordinated pressure applied across multiple fronts simultaneously. The political response escalated in parallel. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen declared publicly that shooting down intruders remained an option on the table, words that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. President Trump added his own combustible rhetoric, suggesting that NATO should be ready to fire on Russian aircraft that entered alliance airspace, though he hedged with the caveat that any response would depend on circumstances. The statements ricocheted through diplomatic channels, forcing allies to choose between solidarity and caution. Poland's foreign minister responded with a terse military-style "Roger that," while Baltic states rushed to support tougher interception rules. Western European capitals were more circumspect, but even skeptics acknowledged the need for stronger defensive postures. Military analysts debated Moscow's endgame. The consensus pointed toward probing operations designed to map NATO response times, identify gaps in coverage, and test political cohesion. Each flight gathered intelligence while demonstrating that Russia maintained global reach despite international sanctions and military setbacks in Ukraine. The strategy was economical in its brutality, force NATO to spend millions on intercepts while risking nothing more than fuel and flight hours. Over time, such pressure could erode readiness and sow doubt among populations questioning whether constant alerts were necessary or paranoid. Some experts advocated pushing NATO's defensive perimeter eastward, intercepting drones and cruise missiles over Ukrainian airspace before they could threaten alliance territory. Others called for increased weapons deliveries to Kiev, arguing that only by raising the cost of Russian operations could the probing be discouraged. The debate revealed deeper fault lines about deterrence philosophy, whether NATO should remain reactive or embrace preemptive action to protect its members. Public opinion fractured along predictable lines. Polls across Europe showed populations divided between those demanding stronger responses and those fearing that aggression would trigger wider war. Media coverage amplified the anxiety, turning each intercept into front-page drama. In Alaska, communities near Elmendorf grew accustomed to the sound of fighters scrambling at odd hours, a reminder that the Cold War had never truly ended, only paused. Chan and his squadron mates flew 3 more intercepts over the following weeks, each encounter playing out with the same dangerous choreography. The bombers approached, American fighters scrambled, both sides shadowed each other at distances measured in heartbeats, and eventually the intruders turned away. But with each repetition, the risks compounded. Pilots grew fatigued, equipment reached the limits of maintenance cycles, and the margin for error shrank. Everyone involved understood that they were dancing on the edge of a precipice, where one mechanical failure, one misread radar signal, one moment of poor judgment could transform posturing into catastrophe.
The September encounter near Alaska ultimately represented something larger than a single intercept. It was a microcosm of the new great power competition, where symbolic gestures carried weight precisely because both sides knew the alternative was unthinkable. Russian bombers would continue probing, American fighters would continue intercepting, and the world would continue watching, wondering whether this dangerous game could be played indefinitely without someone eventually losing control. The answer remained suspended somewhere in the cold Arctic sky, waiting to be written by future encounters that might end very differently than the ones that came before.